川普钦点的国防政策次长科尔比如何看川普第一任期的外交政策，对目前的第二任期意味着什么？美国为什么长期低估中共的真正威胁？现在还来得及应对吗？
I find myself often taking the China threat or the challenge posed by China much more fundamentally and seriously than a lot of other people. And I'm sort of mystified.
科尔比为什么在这方面有远见着实呢？
Our models for thinking, at least in the United States, at least in kind of Washington, still don't really they haven't adapted to that reality as much as they should, I think.
纵观战争历史，美国应该如何决策美中竞争、台海战略以及北韩问题？朋友们好，欢迎来到辛恬面对面，我是辛恬。3年前，我采访了美国知名的国防战略专家科尔比 （Elbridge Colby），他曾经在川普第一任期担任副助理国防部长，主导制定国家防务战略，重塑美国的军事和国防重心。这一次呢，川普给他升官提名他为负责国防部政策的次长。上周在参议院进行听证会。关于中共对美国的威胁、美国的台海战略等方面，科尔比的看法非常的犀利，集中要害那么大家会不会好奇，年纪轻轻的他为什么会比美国大多数的地缘政治专家都有先见之明呢？这就是本期节目要给您带来的答案。有意思的是我是在2022年1月份采访他的，正好是在俄乌战争爆发之前。但是在那个时候科尔比就对俄罗斯乌克兰之间的冲突和潜在的战争有非常清晰的看法，跟川普总统今天的态度呢也是不谋而合。而且他对整个战争的看法他是跟川普有一致性的。那么他们之间到底是谁影响了谁，还是说英雄所见略同呢？请您看到最后，然后来分享一下您的看法好吗？如果您还没有看过上半部分内容的话呢，科尔比主要是解释了为什么中共成为美国最大威胁的主要2个因素，如何采用拒绝预防的策略来应对中共的威胁。他还谈到了美国应该如何衡量亚太地区和中东欧洲地区的布局。建议您呢去看一看，很多朋友都说非常值得看的。好，那现在我们就一起来继续听访谈的下半部分。
You mentioned previously about how China's economy rise in another way, it actually increase its threat to the United States and the world. So except for, you point out how it's really the Chinese people, made it happen. On the other hand, how do you think the role of how the Chinese government took advantage of the United States technology, intellectual property, things like that?
Right. Well, I think you're right. I mean, clearly, a lot of what was happening with China was catch-up, right? I mean, and theft outright of intellectual property and taking an arbitrage on, certain kinds of inefficiencies in the global market or what have you. So, I mean, there was absolutely that happening, but many other countries could have done that. And of course, the United States is not completely innocent. We did something similar to Great Britain in the 19th century. So I'm not, I don't want to take anything away from the accomplishment of the Chinese people and their hard work and skill. In fact, I mean, the way I look at it is, one thing I find a bit odd is, I find myself often taking the China threat or the challenge posed by China much more fundamentally and seriously than a lot of other people. And I'm sort of mystified by this point because, if you look at the numbers, the size of the Chinese economy, the number of people, its geographic position, it's clearly far and away the most important other state in the world. So why aren't people taking it as seriously as I am? And it's sort of strange to me. I don't really fully understand it. But that leads me to think, I tend to be skeptical about, prognoses of the future about China that say China's about to collapse or China's got clay feet. It's possible, it could run into something like what happened to Japan in the early 1990s. So it's possible. Even if it did happen, China would still be enormously powerful. So we still have to think about a lot in this way. And secondly, the people who are investing money in the world seem to not think that China's about to fall apart. I mean, there's a lot of capital going into China, not just from the United States, but elsewhere too. So that suggests to me that people who actually are putting money on the table think that China has significant continued growth. Obviously, not at the rates that it's had in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but at a pretty significant rate. Certainly relative to most of the OECD economies, which are not growing. I mean, the United States, off and on is growing pretty well, but Europe or Japan are not doing very well. So it's sort of relative.
For yourself, when did you started to really realize the great threat of China?
It's a good question. I would say probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I mean, I was thinking about China before that, but me personally, it wasn't clear to me that at that time, I mean, I was pretty young, and it wasn't clear to me that the more sort of Kissinger approach was necessarily wrong. But as I've kind of thought it through and seen how China's behaved, I've become more and more convinced that we need to have a clear balance of power, that we need to have, China needs to not get the wrong idea. And I think the people who are advocating this sort of G2 model are not helping. I mean, so although I don't think there's much, I think in the United States, people are pretty much everybody's worried about China across the political spectrum, maybe for different reasons or in different ways. But I think that's it. But and I think just looking at the, and as I mentioned, I grew up in Asia, so I've been familiar. But I mean, growing up, say, 30, 40 years ago, the number of economies that were really significant. I mean, it was basically Japan. And then you had the Asian, you had South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore to some extent, but it was pretty minor. I mean, the ASEAN economies were very underdeveloped. I mean, just out of real poverty. I mean, there's still real poverty there, but as a nation, today, China is. I mean, South Korea is wealthier than many parts of Europe, and China, parts of China are the same. And the ASEAN countries have developed tremendously. I mean, I think Malaysia has a per capita GDP over $30,000 a year, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, it's just Asia's the center of the world. And I think that's become more and more clear to me. But our models for thinking, at least in the United States, at least in kind of Washington, still don't really they haven't adapted to that reality as much as they should, I think.
Tell us about maybe a little bit about how your experience growing up in Asia. How did that help you understand the geopolitical, situation in Asia and China, and what do you think for Americans? What they possibly be missing in realizing that part?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think my approach, my approach is very, it's kind of. Not very culturally narrow. So, I mean, my lens applies to Europe. It applies to Asia. It doesn't matter what color you are, what your religion is. I mean, actually, I think you could use my model if you were, an emperor penguin or a great ape. I mean, I think that the logic of strategy tends to transcend cultures. That said, I think I'm actually the fourth generation in my family to live in Asia. My great-grandfather lived in China, and even going back before that, I've had engagement with China. I don't know if it's given me any special. I mean, I think it's given me a familiarity maybe with Asia, and a sense perhaps that of Asia, the kind of reality of and the promise of what Asia is and can do. In a way that I think, I was thinking actually earlier today, Washington is an East Coast city. It faces the Atlantic. It's a lot easier to get to London than it is to get to Tokyo or Seoul or Beijing. And I think at some level, the human cultural networks, the transatlantic network here, the Middle East network, they're just easier and they're more deeply rooted. And maybe if anything, my Asian experience maybe just kind of compensates for that. Just kind of for the way I mentioned that I still think people, it's not so true in the commercial world where I think people making money understand that Asia's where it's happening, and China are so important. But in the geopolitics and kind of foreign policy world, it hasn't caught up as much. And that lag is really dangerous because it's not mapping correctly to the world as it is.
To be frank, when we came to this country about, over 20 years ago, at that time, for some reason, we just felt, how come the Americans are not realizing so much about the danger of the Chinese Communist Party? Mm-hmm. That's always been, like for us, we kind of, to be frank, very worried. Mm-hmm. But we just felt, well, people just don't pay attention because they don't really think that's important.
I think that's it. I mean, I just don't think that, I think a lot of people don't think that China's really that, they think it's kind of a hollow shell. I think lurking behind a lot of the people out there saying, oh, let's bomb Iran and let's fight Russia and Ukraine. I'm thinking, well, the most powerful, richest state in the world since the emergence of the United States itself is sitting over there in Asia. So there's some implicit element in these people's mind that's saying it's for some reason they don't need to worry about it as much. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. And what's funny, though, is that, I mean, if you went back 70 years ago, people were terrified of the Chinese Communist Party in Washington. And actually, if you go back before World War II, a lot of, particularly the Republican Party, was not interested in Europe. It was much more interested in Asia. So if you go kind of to, and there was, of course, a long, very strong connection between America and China, that the Protestant missionaries, the trade, some of it opium, unfortunately, but much of it not. A lot of early American fortunes were made in that shipping trade. So there is a strong connection, but I think you're right. And I think it's very dangerous, and it's something that not only is the CCP very dangerous, extremely dangerous, and very capable and ruthless, but the kind of implicit discounting of how dangerous it is also very dangerous.
So just from what you talk about the strategies, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. How does that differ from like President Reagan's peace through strength?
Well, not so different. I mean, President Reagan, he didn't do everything perfectly, but I think he got the basics very right, which is, peace through strength, and look, I think one of the great things about Reagan was he had a huge military buildup that the American people, vehemently supported. And he didn't start any wars. There was the intervention in Grenada, and I guess there was the Lebanon thing. But Reagan did not get into a whole bunch of conflicts all around the world with the military. And to me, that's success. Be strong. Don't get involved in peripheral things that get people hurt for no real gain. And focus on the big thing and then win. So if we could be like President Reagan in that respect, that would be great. And I mean, look, the people say, oh, the Chinese, the mainland, PRC, they value Taiwan so much they'd never give it up. And it's like, well, Mao Zedong was possibly the worst person who ever lived in human history. I mean, I think he's certainly in the running. He clearly didn't care about human life, but he never tried to invade the island of Taiwan because he knew he would lose. So, the way you deal with someone like that, if you can't get rid of them, which we can't in practice, using force at least, is to be so strong that they don't, get the wrong impression. Don't go overboard. I mean, don't start a war unnecessarily or something, but we're in no danger. We're in no danger of overdoing it at this point. I mean, the Chinese have been increasing their defense spending in Asia 10% every year for like 30 years, and we haven't done anything, basically.
Would you mind to talk a little bit about how do you think President Trump's strategy during his era in terms of foreign policy?
Well, I think the most important thing, like in a century, I think people will look back at President Trump and the administration and say, this is when the fundamental shift on China happened. And the decision to recognize that China was the problem and needed to be confronted in order to deal with it and keep China, from taking over Asia and ultimately developing a preeminent position in the world. So I think it was the right strategy, and I think he saw that, and he deserves credit for it. Obviously, there are other people, and Matt Pottinger and others who played a critical role. And I think what you could say about the Trump administration is there wasn't always a coherent and clear-headed overall strategy. But on the other hand, that's pretty unusual. Again, the Trump administration didn't get into any new conflicts. It wasn't able to end the Afghanistan conflict in a good way. I mean, the Biden administration did not end Afghanistan. I supported the withdrawal, but I think they handled it very, very badly. I think we had a right to expect more. But I think, what you can say about the Trump administration is that the implementation and how to execute this overall shift and reorientation, that was lacking. But that's in the context of a major, the major basic thing was absolutely right, and was something that was not obvious. I don't think if that necessarily would have happened if the default Republican had been elected.
How do you think can the United States win war in the way that American people would support?
Well, I think the key is to be so prepared and ready and focused that it won't be so costly that it will be out of proportion to the gains. So, imbued in my book is the idea, the idea, if you go back to the famous German strategist Clausewitz, that war is a kind of a political act, and it should, if it's to be rational. And so it needs to be connected to those interests. And the way it's fought needs to be connected to those interests. And so part of the reason I'm so obsessively focused on Taiwan and China is because it's going to take hard work to develop the force and to posture that force correctly to be able to fight in a way that isn't so costly. So, the example that I think comes to mind is, if we had a way of defeating the Japanese attacks on the American possessions and even potentially the European possessions in East Asia in 1941, 1942 at a much lower cost, then we wouldn't have had to fight that whole, horribly bloody campaign across the Pacific. That it would have been a better approach, than losing all of those people if we'd had a way to fight, to defend ourselves more effectively forward. Similarly, if we'd had American forces stationed, in France and Belgium in 1936, 1937, 1938, maybe the Germans would have said, this isn't worth it, or we would have been able to defeat a German invasion in 1940 because the Americans would have been involved. Instead, we had to mobilize 13 million men, invade Europe from, kick the Germans out, hundreds of thousands. So, it's better to, it's kind of like a question of balance. You don't want to go too far forward for sure. But also, if you pull too far back, you may get the war anyway, but then you have to fight it from a much more costly position. So what I'm trying to argue for is if we have this denial defense where we can defend our allies, we'll be able to do it at a lower cost. By the way, that will encourage our allies to do more because they can be confident that they're not going to be abandoned. So if you're on Taiwan and you're hearing me, hopefully what you hear is, hey, look, if we put more money and effort into our defense, the Americans will be there and they'll be fighting in a smart way. Same in Japan. And that is kind of a virtuous cycle where we both are stronger, our line is stronger, and then the PRC says, sure, I'd love to take over Taiwan, but I just can't do it. I'm going to have to find another way.
Yeah, that really makes sense. So how do you feel about the threat from the North Korea?
North Korea is a really tough one because it's fundamentally a distraction. It's not something that can pose. It has no ability to sort of directly harm the geopolitical interests of the United States. The basic interests of the United States. It's really because it poses a threat to South Korea and then to some extent to Japan as well. And it's such an erratic and dangerous actor that, anything's possible from them. But, this is also where I think President Trump had a kind of instinct. It didn't pan out. But actually, we don't want North Korea to be completely aligned with China, which they're not. And of course, the North Korean government is probably the worst in the world. But, I'm not exactly sure where North Korea will go over the next 10 years, because I imagine that they don't want to be just in the pocket of the PRC. I mean, the North Koreans expelled the Chinese, even though the Chinese had basically saved them in the Korean War. Kim Il-sung kicked out, the Chinese advisors in, I think, the 50s or 60s. And the North Koreans traditionally were aligned with the USSR in the intra-communist divide. So I think we need to look for opportunities without compromising, the interests, the defense of South Korea or Japan. And it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. And they're a very, distasteful is too weak. It's a loathsome system of government. But on the other hand, if we were willing to work with Mao Zedong to deal with the Soviet Union, then I think we may need to be able to same with the Russians. We have to understand who's the most serious danger in the world, and that's the PRC. And everything else will need to fit into that model, basically.
And how do you think the focus of our military right now in facing such a threat?
It's not enough. It's not enough. It's not changing fast enough. And that's the frustrating thing, is because there's a lot of rhetorical support for what I'm saying, and other people are saying it too. Bob Work of, former, and David Ochmanek, two former Obama Pentagon officials, and others are making similar arguments. But it's just the change is not happening fast in the military, partially because the political demand signal continues to be, look, the administration has now said they might increase forces in Europe. Well, that's the exact opposite of the signal that we need to be sending, and Secretary of Defense Austin was at the Manama dialogue a couple months ago, big Middle Eastern shindig, and telegraphing that, we're going to stay in the Middle East. He could be not telling the truth, I guess. I don't know, but I find that kind of hard to believe. And inflation is eating up a lot of the defense budget. Personally, I would prefer not to spend more on defense if we could find a way, but I'd rather spend more on defense than, risk a war with China, because they think they have an opportunity. So that's kind of why I'm trying to really, bang the drum here, is I think, a penny of prevention and deterrence now, or even 10 pennies, will be better than a pound of war later. We don't want to get there. And I think time is short.
Right now, the Chinese Communist government is kind of working with what the Biden current administration trying to say, we also need to cooperate on certain issues like climate change, new energy, things like that. On the other hand, people, as common Americans, they worry about some business dealings between the politicians and their, friends with China. So how do you think this could play into our, dealing with such threat?
Well, I think this idea of cooperating and competing doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it's just it's sort of this. There was an article in the New York Times a couple of months ago that was saying, they're going to be cooperating on climate change while they're quote unquote jousting in the South China Sea, as if it's sort of, you're going to play a game of tennis and be very tough on the tennis court, but then afterwards you'll have a nice iced tea or a glass of wine together or something like that. It's just sort of a ridiculous idea when you're dealing with, not only a great power, but, the communists, right? This is not how they operate. I mean, say what you will about Xi Jinping. He's a dyed-in-the-wool communist. So I think I have to believe that most of the people talking about this don't actually believe it, because it's so ridiculous.
Why they do that?
I think they might be trying to placate their left wing in the administration, because I think on the left there's a lot of skepticism about taking on China, and maybe some of them do believe it. But as I understand it, when Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, went to, I think she was in Tianjin or something, I can't remember where exactly she was, but the Chinese basically said, no way, we will link cooperation on climate with, what you say about Taiwan or South China Sea or Xinjiang. And by the way, something like climate is inherently geopolitical, because it has to do with economic growth over time. And there's nothing more important to geopolitics than how much you grow, because that determines how strong you are. So this notion that climate policy would be independent of geopolitics is absurd. I mean, I think there are arguments. Andrew Erickson of the Naval War College has, I think, argued, how you could link climate and geopolitics. Okay, that's a very interesting argument that people should take seriously for sure. But this notion that, we're going to cooperate on climate and the pandemic and proliferation and all the things that actually the administration says it really cares about, and not give China what it wants on the things that it cares about. I don't think the Chinese are going along with it. So it's not a serious strategy. I assume it's not their real strategy because it obviously won't work. In terms of the business dealings, I think there are serious concerns there. I mean, clearly Chinese money has had and influence is a serious challenge. I mean, the United Front Work Department, other things. I think Secretary Pompeo gave a big speech on this, I guess about a year and a half ago, maybe. That's a serious concern, and I think there'll need to be more transparency and scrutiny on these issues about where some of this money is coming from. I mean, I think we're going to have a significant economic relationship with China. I mean, we need to grow, they need to grow, but we're going to have to be much more careful, and there's going to need to be more scrutiny about it than in the past.
Thank you so much. Just the final word about your book. So what do you think people can get from the book?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, matters of war and peace in a republic, they should be matters for all the citizenry, not just the self-styled or self-appointed elite, the people in the Beltway or what have you. It's a book, I mean, it's a democracy. People vote and we're all supposed to participate. And this book, I wrote it in a way, it's not necessarily a breeze, but I wrote it in a way that I wanted it to be accessible to everybody if they put their effort into it. And I've been pleased that I have family members who are not in this field who said, Bridge, I read the whole book, I got it, it made sense. That's really very gratifying to me because I think people will understand in a very brass tacks, intuitive way. I'm not making vague arguments about the rules-based international order. I'm making arguments that I think are rooted in human experience that people will understand. And it's hopefully not doctrinaire. If somebody doesn't agree with me, they can see the logic of my argument. They can see why they would go in a different way. Great, okay. That if I'm promoting a debate within this context, then that's all the better. So, and the book's available on Amazon. There's an audiobook and a Kindle as well, if you prefer those kind of modalities. And hope people really enjoy it and learn something from it.
Great, thank you, Elbridge.
Thank you.
上面这段对话，科尔比再次强调了中共构成的战略挑战，以及美国需要如何调整来应对这一现实。您是不是觉得他的很多观点都跟川普总统相似呢？包括俄乌冲突并没有中共威胁来的重要，以及战争要考虑成本，要与利益挂钩等等。好，请您留言看看您是不是也是这么认为的呢？科尔比提醒我们，面对中共这样的对手，轻视和误判都可能是致命的。他的观点也许并不一定被所有人认同，但是他提出的问题值得我们每个人思考。美国和世界准备好了吗？这场访谈呢，虽然是在3年前做的但是放到今天呢，依然是振聋发聩。尤其是现在，他很可能在接下来4年为美国制定国防政策、军事战略的大将所以是非常值得深入的了解他的思路。那么他的书《拒绝预防大国冲突时代的美国防御》或许是个好起点哦。但是如果您没有时间去看，或者英文还没有那么好的话，那辛恬所做的这个上下2集的专访，就是他的思路和观点的一些精华呈现哦。所以请您点赞、收藏、转发好吗？好，在这里呢，也要感谢在最近几期节目中有订阅辛恬面对面频道的朋友，帮助我们的订阅量呢超过了28000。所以有朋友就鼓励我在3月份定下目标，突破3万订阅。您觉得有没有可能呢？我想呢试一下但是要靠朋友们的大力支持，因为还是很有可能的。为什么呢？因为目前辛恬面对面的每期节目观看的观众平均呢47%、48%是已经订阅的朋友，而有52%、53%还是没有订阅的，所以呢非常有潜力啊。好，那就请朋友们检查一下您有没有订阅，打开小铃铛。 好，非常感谢您的收看和支持，我们就下次节目再见喽，拜拜。订阅新田面对面频道，并打开小铃铛，这样就不会错过最新的视频节目了。